Hey there, James here. Just real quickly wanted to say that in the video that you're about to see, I touch on a topic that is politically charged currently, but I do my best in the video to not make a political point for either side of the argument. The ultimate goal of this video isn't to persuade you to a political point, to a political idea, but to ultimately illuminate and to make known how the current directions, the current methods by which political entities are acting on state and national government levels presents an unintended, quite dangerous second order of consequences to all of us as American citizens and our rights and freedoms. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome back to another Squire defense video, and honestly this is a video that I didn't ever want to feel compelled to make, right? The subject matter that I'm about to talk about is one of those things that frankly I hoped it would never come to, at least in my lifetime, and obviously in my children's and so on. Like, I don't wish this on anyone. So if you're not aware, right now in Virginia there's a big hullabaloo going on between the state level government and a lot of the individual citizens of the state, including law enforcement and all. So basically what's happening is in the recent election, the Democratic Party won the House, won their two houses of their state legislature, and they already had a Democratic governor in place by the name of Ralph Northam. And they very much wanted to push for new gun control legislature. And, as I stated earlier, this video is not going to be, about like any of the political stuff in terms of like whether or not I agree or disagree, etc. So that's what they wanted to do. And to help kind of speed that process along, to help kind of streamline everything, since they control both houses and the presidency, so obviously they're not going to block their own policy that they're trying to get put into place. They pre-filed a bunch of these bills before they've even come into session. Their next session won't start until January. So those bills were reported upon what they contained, and in response to a lot of these gun control measures, a lot of the local, like city and county level governments, over 100 actually, and over 90 counties in the state, have declared themselves Second Amendment sanctuaries, including in the majority of those Second Amendment sanctuary counties. The law enforcement has said they will not enforce any of these new gun control laws because they are unconstitutional, not just with the national constitution, but also with the Virginian state constitution, which has within it an amendment, a Bill of Rights, similar to the federal constitution. And in the Virginia state constitution, it actually goes to further, I guess, explain what the Virginian original government who drafted their constitution considered for the Second Amendment, and for what additional protections they wanted to place and additional clarifications they wanted to place on the state level for Virginia residents on their rights to keep and bear firearms. And again, I'm not going to debate whether someone should or should not be allowed to. I'm just pointing out that currently it is the law. And what concerns me is that a lot of these laws that are being passed or about to be passed by this, Virginian state level government completely ignores not only the national constitution but also the state level constitution. Right? They attempt to circumvent it entirely, and all. And then, so in response to this kind of outcry by the people of the state, the vast majority of the people of the state, there's, I think, 5 or 6 was when it had last been reported at the time of my making this video, that there were only 5 or 6 counties in the state that had voted to not become Second Amendment sanctuaries. So with all that being said, the governor and some of the members of the legislature began to become concerned about this. They began to threaten that they will take away funding from the police departments who refuse to carry out this law. Who refuse to enforce this law, that they would call in the Virginia National Guard if need be to basically force this confiscation, and become in essence like a military state of emergency, and then ultimately they basically offered to grandfather in potentially some of the currently owned firearms by members of the state. And then it was reported today, at the time of this video being recorded, that the governor had decided that they needed to allocate additional funds to their prison system in anticipation of individuals refusing to comply with these laws, and to jail people who are currently not breaking any Virginian laws or federal law in owning these firearms, and but obviously that would change. And so what concerns me here is not the moral implications of someone owning a firearm. Like, it's the methodology by which this establishment, this government, is choosing to, in essence, change these laws or to change the way that things are enforced, right? So within the national constitution, we have the Second Amendment, and if you're against individuals other than military police owning firearms, and you want to get rid of that ability for people to do so, that's doable, that's achievable under the Constitution, right? The Constitution has a provision for creating and changing amendments, right, within the Constitution. So we can amend the Constitution and take away amendments, or we can amend the Constitution and add amendments. And so there's two ways to do that. And I wanted to make sure that I got this correct in terms of like how I'm going to present this information. So I did a little bit of research just to brush up on it. So there's two ways that this can be accomplished. The first of which is the method that's actually happened in the past. And that is that a bill has to pass both of the national houses, so the House and the Senate, by 2/3 majority in each. Then once it has passed, it goes on to the state. And then the states will each have to ratify it. And typically there's a time limit. But once it's been ratified by enough of the states, it becomes a new amendment. So, you could say, hey, for this amendment, we're going to get rid of the Second Amendment. And then you could go about that process and do it, right? And then the other way is to actually completely bypass Congress on a national level entirely. And it's for a constitutional convention to be called by the legislatures of the states themselves. And if you have 2/3 of the states call for this, then they basically they send forth the proposed amendment to the Constitution. And if 3/4 of the legislatures or conventions of these states agree to ratify it, then it becomes a new constitutional amendment. So that's a way to kind of circumvent Congress if Congress isn't playing ball and all the states agree that this needs to happen. Both of them require a 3/4 ratification by the states. So 3 out of every 4 states have to agree, yes, we'll accept this as a new constitutional amendment, and then it goes into place. So that's what concerns me, right? Because whether or not you agree with the right to bear arms, and if you believe that that shouldn't be a right anymore, again, there's a legal precedent within the most foundational laws of our nation to do so. And what concerns me is the unintended second order of consequences that inevitably always happens. Every decision you make, no matter how simple it may seem, will inevitably have other impacts on your life. And whenever you're talking about an entity as large and as powerful, and that it touches so many people's lives as a state and federal government, that is exponentially compounded. And so if we look like, and again, I'm not going to get political here on like calling out people, but if we look at like the Bush administration, like during his presidency, the centralized power of the national government grew more than it ever had before. And that didn't start with him, but it's just easy to point to because it happened in my lifetime at a point in which I was old enough to understand what was going on. And so, with the passing of like the Patriot Act, for example, there was the ability of the federal government to circumvent constitutional rights of American citizens in ways that had never been done before. And then again, during the Obama administration, we had, again, a growth of the federal government's power and the president specifically as well, with more executive orders being put in and enacted, which basically bypasses Congress, and the president just kind of says, hey, this is the new rule of the land. Congress can override it. They seldom do, but more of them than had ever been done by a previous president. And then obviously that paved the way for President Trump and the current administration, not just the presidency, but also obviously Congress, to continue to build upon those foundations laid before them. And so all that being said is, like, once a precedent is set legally, it's going to repeat itself, right? Unless a court knocks it down and then everyone kind of agrees. Because as much as we may have been founded upon, like, the principles of the Constitution, ultimately they're just ideas, right? It's ultimately just a piece of paper. And if people don't back it and support it and say, hey, if this is not abided by, then there will be real world consequences beyond, oh, you just didn't follow this written word, then those words ultimately mean nothing. And so my concern is not so much that this is just that people are going to lose their Second Amendment rights. Like, I'm not speaking on that concern in this video, although I personally strongly believe in your right to be independent, as long as you're obviously not harming anyone else. But that's not the point here. So the point being, like, if we set this precedent where your rights can just be taken away by lower level laws and we just ignore these state and federal level constitutions, where does that end? It obviously isn't going to end for long at all with only the Second Amendment. So if you suddenly take away the ability of the common folk to own firearms, right? The ultimate equalizer. And the federal government is like, okay, that's done. We circumvented that. We threw out the Second Amendment without actually going through the constitutional processes of removing the Second Amendment. What's to stop them from taking away your Fifth Amendment right? What's to stop them from taking away your First Amendment? Suddenly freedom of speech goes out the door if the federal government is like, you know what, we just don't want that. And everyone's like, well, we don't care. It's a constitutional right. And the government's like, yeah, but, you know, we took away your Second Amendment right and we didn't have to actually follow the Constitution to do so, and nobody really did anything about it, so we can do the same thing here. And in that instance, let's say hypothetically it gets to that point, you don't have the ability as a citizenry to prevent them from enacting that, right? Like, if suddenly you don't have your firearms, then you have no way of actually fighting, for example, the military, which I'm a part of, if the federal government decides they're going to enact their new laws, their new desires through force, which is ultimately how every law is enacted, right? Ultimately, there is the threat of force. It's you do this or you will go to jail, or you don't do this or you will go to jail. Eventually it gets to that point. Maybe there's fines or whatever beforehand, but eventually the underlying threat is forced compliance. And where does this end? And I don't think that this ends well. So all that being said, right, that's kind of the first route that I can see this going, because ultimately I see there's three possibilities that what happens in Virginia can end, and none of them are overwhelmingly positive because of the precedent that they set and the inevitable second order of consequences that will come from these, which is what's so frustrating to me, because I honestly believe that Mr. Northam and the rest of these members of Congress are being short-sighted, ignorant, and ultimately foolish in these decisions. I'm not necessarily calling their decisions to try to, disarm their populace or whatever. I'm not speaking on whether that's right or wrong. That's not what this video is ultimately about. But the way in which they're choosing to do so, the doors that opens up. So let's say that all this goes through, right? That all these laws go through, that no one ultimately opposes them, or the people who do are so few and far between that easily the police or whatever, they all comply, they all go along with it, and they arrest the few troublemakers, and we go on from there. And then we potentially have state or federal level governments taking away rights based upon whatever they deem. I'm just trampling over the constitutions of the state and the federal government if they choose that they don't agree with it, as that current administration, which is a terrible, terrible precedent to set. So then the second option that could potentially happen is the federal government gets involved, right? And we see something kind of like we saw way back with Andrew Jackson whenever the states were initially threatening to secede before the Civil War actually kicked off. And we see the president basically call in the military to put down what is in essence an insurrection. And the obvious danger here is like you have loss of life, and nobody wants that. And you have, to whatever degree, a small scale war. And obviously that's something, especially in our current political climate, to be avoided at all costs. And nobody ultimately wins in that scenario. And let's say the president and the federal government step in and they smash this. Ultimately what that does is that sets a precedent of increased federal power over the states, right? So it says, hey, you're the states, you made a decision. We as the federal government did not agree with it. Now, we could argue that legally with the Constitution on a federal level, with other precedents set, that they would be in the legal right to do so. But it furthers that precedent and makes it easier for the federal government to legally say, hey, we're in the right to step in and tell these states what they can and can't do by physical, potentially military force far more easily. So that opens the door to that, and that's a dangerous thing as well. And then the third possibility is probably the most dangerous, and that's that we end up with a Virginia Civil War. And I don't want to even speculate how that would go, and I don't want to even really speculate like how that might spread to other parts of the country. Again, with how politically charged we are, and with this current culture we have, where we have so many just outbreaks of violence by groups, no matter who they identify as, whether it's Antifa, whether it's like the far alt-right, no matter who it is, like we just have so many groups that are ready to go in this politically charged climate that our media and our politicians have only pushed further and further and further into. So Virginia could, in essence, be a powder keg that could start other conflicts, perhaps not on a huge scale, but across the country, and nobody wants to see that. And again, that's just an unnecessary loss of life when all this could have been accomplished, one way or the other. Like this could have actually just been a civil discussion, and we could have avoided this by just following the law precedent already set within this country instead of circumventing that. So if we do go that third route, then we have to ask the question of like, where does that fork off as well, right? So if we end up with the federal government doesn't get involved, and we end up with the citizenry of Virginia are not okay with just rolling over and taking this government, not following the processes in state and federal constitutions and underlying law, and just saying, hey, our new law is going to circumvent that. We're just going to throw all of that out, in essence, wherever we choose to. And we end up with this violence. The question becomes like, where does that end? So does it become like a true state uprising and the people overthrow their government officials? And then at what point is that going too far in terms of like, do they simply forcibly remove and in essence jail these people who were legally elected? And that's a whole other issue in terms of like problems of that rises up. Or we have the possibility of the federal government getting involved. And again, there's problems either way. If the federal government says, hey, the people are in the right because you've ignored the constitutional provisions for changing policies and changing amendments that you find problematic, and you've circumvented them, and therefore you're an enemy to this country, to the elected government of that state, that, again, that's a dangerous precedent for an abuse of centralized federal power to the state's level. And then if you have the other direction where the federal government is like, hey, these are the duly elected individuals, and they get involved and they put down, a quote-unquote uprising by the Virginian people, well, then they're lending credence to that policy of the state government saying, well, we don't really care what the Constitution says, we don't really care what the state constitution says, and we don't really care about the policies in place for changing those things. We're just going to make new laws that circumvent and ignore that those policies that are already in place. And so either way, you have this danger of the federal government giving too much support and due to precedent to one of those two directions, either whether it's a state uprising and suddenly that's more of an okay thing, or to state governments, in essence, being overly tyrannical. And either way, the federal government grows in power in ways that we shouldn't want it to as a free society and as a free nation that is a constitutional republic that practices democracy on the local levels and then votes in a national election, which then selects delegates to then vote for the president in the way that they were voted for, kind of as like a buffer for a true democracy for a presidential election. So no matter what of any of those three options, this doesn't turn out well. Honestly, the only way I see this turning out well is for the government of Virginia to back down and to say, you know what, you're right. We can have this discussion. We can go about doing this the legal way. Because let's say that they choose that route, right? Let's say that this fourth way that I don't see happening, but let's say that it happens and they back down. They're like, you know what, you're right. We're going to go about this the correct way that's already legally established within the state and national constitution. And then let's say they go back and they change the state level constitution and they take away the state level constitution giving the right to bear arms to Virginian citizenry. And then let's say that the national level agrees with them. And we have a 3/4 majority of the states, whether it's through the traditional means that have already been accomplished multiple times or whether it's through constitutional conventions, agree and remove the Second Amendment. All right, then if you have both of those things happen, and now there is no national guarantee of your right to bear arms, and we fast forward into time and we get to the same position, right? And we get to all that's happened, and now the Virginian government is like, hey, you can't own these firearms anymore, just like we were originally going to say. Then the people of Virginia would have no leg to stand on, legally speaking. And so then it would be, in my opinion, like a much more straightforward decision by the federal government to say, hey, this is ultimately an unacceptable insurrection. We've gone through all the legal processes established. We've changed the laws to represent what we as a country want on the most foundational level. And the average citizenry of Virginia would be in the wrong. But as it currently stands, legally, they are foundationally in the right, and that's the problem. The problem is that it's come to this, right? The problem is that that the state government is legally in the wrong, and we have this real split in terms of like what's going to happen. So that being said, I just wanted to do this video real quick because obviously this is something that's deeply bothering me, something I want to share, something I want to bring awareness to, because obviously the national media doesn't care. The national media is incredibly split, incredibly partisan, incredibly biased, and the same is true of the two major political parties. And so we have these entities that are only self-concerned, and they're obviously not reporting on this, nor are they covering the potential problems that arise from any of these possibilities as outcomes. With that being said, this is James signing off. Be safe.